Very descriptive. Thank you very much. So what questions are there, conversations you've had, thoughts that you've been riddled by, other reactions that you've had since we last talked? Yeah.
One thing that was really interesting for me, last Thursday I had a training for a missions trip I'm leading with my church, and we were talking about different kinds of cultures and like guilt cultures and fear cultures, but like nothing was said about American culture, which like I guess that's fair because missions like kind of elsewhere, like global missions, but I just thought it was kind of interesting because it was like almost like we don't even acknowledge that this is like a big thing, which like I guess that's fair because I don't.
Well, that's so big of you to include yourself in the culture. Thank you so much.
But I thought that was really interesting. And, like,
yeah.
I thought it was funny. I laughed when she said it, and then it did not fit in place in that conversation.
Yeah.
So I just kind of looked down.
Oh well, no shame there, right?
No. I'm the youngest one there. That's my excuse.
Oh, okay. Other thoughts, reactions, conversations you've had? Yes, ma'am.
I had a conversation with one of my mentors, and like just was talking about things that I was learning. And she asked me to name my shame, which I thought but like just like of like if you're shamed from disappointment or from like this or this, and that was really cool to like really be able to kind of like begin to search through that.
Yeah. Well, given the word cloud we had, everybody just fill in their name.
You laughed at that.
Huh?
I just love that you laughed at that.
Why? I mean, it's so exquisitely ironic because it's kind of a standard thing. I mean, to name your shame, and what would happen if you said, Clarice? What would your mentor do? Yeah, well, yeah, yeah. Because remember, that was the one thing that separated grace and shame, right? Was identity. And that I think I told you guys, maybe I didn't. I haven't seen you since then. That happened in the other section. I wondered, after we did our word cloud, and we noted that identity showed up in shame, it didn't in grace. And I thought, that's interesting. And then I did it with the section on Thursday morning, and the exact same thing happened again. It was really pretty fascinating. So, any other conversations, questions, things we provoked? Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 small points. I definitely did not rip you off in my mission trip. I like literally got my notes out and like quoted them at them.
Oh, okay. At them. That was so personal of you. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
But like we're talking about like we can't be an effective team if we like don't know anything about each other and we only know like what we want each other to know, kind of, and like the surface level stuff that we can present to each other. And so that was something that I like really emphasized with them. And then also, I don't know if any of you guys are a family site, but our family dynamics. But I was reading the textbook, and the authors had a chart like towards the end, and you might know exactly what I'm talking about. Saying like,
nah.
They have like hurting to healing behaviors, and one of them, the hurting behavior was self-centeredness, and the problem on a personal level is feeling unworthy of love. And then, like the solution was selflessness.
Yeah.
And then one of the other things was like perfectionism was the hurting behavior, and the solution, like the healing behavior, was acceptance. But they didn't talk at all about like shame and like how like it's you don't feel unworthy of love because you're selfish. I mean,
a lot of Christians would have you believe that.
Well, yeah, not disrespect from a family is what the book is called.
Yeah.
And they were saying like, well, you like, yeah, acceptance might be the opposite of perfectionism, or maybe like the cure, but you can't cure perfectionism without curing the shame that like lies underneath it. And so I pointed that out, and I want to write them a letter, but
a strongly worded one, I'm sure.
No, it was really interesting to me because they were talking like all of the hurting behaviors they listed were shame based.
Right.
I think there was one that wasn't, and then but they like
right.
never talked about like you need to address shame within the family system in order to move towards these healing behaviors.
Yeah, and I've this is the first spring that I've not taught that class because of you guys. It's all your fault. No, and the Balswicks started talking about that stuff before everybody else did. I mean, those 4 dimensions they talk about with empowerment and grace and covenant, and I forget the 4th one, but
Intimacy.
Yeah, intimacy, and that. But the conversation, the thing you have to keep in mind, and this is exactly the reason why I have you reading what most people would say is a secular author about shame, because nobody in the church is talking about it. Now, Kurt Thompson is, that's why I chose the book, but it is still a pretty materialistically oriented book. By that I mean, he's fascinated with the kind of the mind-body interactions around it. And that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But he's not getting at it from the perspective that Brene Brown is in kind of a social, relational context as to how that plays out. And, if all things goes well and, the creek don't rise, I might actually have a book that actually fills that gap, because that's exactly what I wanted to write about and talk about. Because it in 3 weeks' time, you might have some more notes, because in 3 weeks' time we'll be talking about the stained glass self. And some of you guys have heard some of that. You will not have heard this full version, because I had all summer to develop it further. Developmentally and just relationally and in a family context. Because guess where we learn all this stuff? And that's not blaming family. It's just saying that's the crucible in which we learn this stuff. So I'll credit you with plagiarizing me later. Yes, Justin.
Why do you think the church doesn't talk about shame?
Because I honestly believe that a lot of churches would rather have people change according to shame than with grace. I think Kyle Idemann's right. I mean, you don't find too many churches competing to see who can talk about grace more. And I think it's because of a lot of pastors, and Idleman would be, I think, at times equally accused. There are a lot of pastors that believe if they preached about grace, that they would be giving people license to sin. And in my humble opinion, that's a pretty shallow way of looking at grace. Besides the fact, if we preached it the right way, if we preached it fully in terms of how it's presented in Scripture, it would give people a motivation not to. So I think there's a lot of that. I'll tell you, I'll rat out one pastor I worked for. You don't know his name, so you don't care. I was working at a church in the state I was in. I won't tell you that before I came here. If you guys know that, whatever. And I had a recovery ministry that I had started up, and I wanted to bring Brandon Manning in to speak. And I had to run it by the senior pastor. And I did, and he said, wasn't he a Catholic priest? First question. I said, yeah, so. He said, the second answer was, no, I don't really want him in our church because he talks too much about grace.
I don't get it.
Huh?
I don't get that. It drives me crazy because my church does this.
That's not the rules. I'll heap shame on you for not doing. No. Go ahead.
Okay, but I mean,
Yeah.
seriously, it drives me crazy, and especially, but like, being at CC, like, I've had some, like, I found out last night about some stuff that's going on with, like, my character being targeted by people, and, like, no grace, not even truth in that, was,
Right.
like, a different issue, but then, like, within the context of the church, how much more powerful the gospel would be, okay, hear what I mean, not what I say, how much more powerful the gospel would be if we, like, understood grace, caught it correctly, like, how many of, like, our problems and how, like, all of this stuff would not necessarily go away, but be solved, because then Christians would be seen as, oh, we've got, like, our picket lines and all this other crap, and, like, we, like, everyone, like, I've had, my best friend is, he's gay, a guy he was dating, didn't want to be around him because I'm Christian. Not knowing me at all, just because I'm Christian. And it infuriates me that is the way that Christians are perceived, and I really do think that is because we don't preach grace, because no one...
Listen, we don't preach... I'll tell you... Let me slow down your rant there for a second. We don't preach grace because we don't know grace. It's just that simple. So, and I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. I've been a pastor. I know what it's like to try to preach something. I know that feeling. And it's awful. Of course, the problem is I'm also a psychologist, which explodes people's heads, because I love to get up and say, I'm preaching today and I'm a psychologist. It's like, now that I've got your attention, now let's talk about how screwed up you all are. I honestly believe that most of the books that have been written, and I'm plowing through almost all of them in the Christian publishing world about grace, have focused almost entirely on salvation. Almost entirely, without exception. There are only a couple. The one I chose for you to read was just an uneasy acceptance on my part, because there are things that he's written in there that I have. You don't want to see the margins of that book that I read. You really don't want to look at that. But he's about as close as they get to a reasonable approach to preaching grace, because it's a Me Too thing more. And what catches your attention is his example of punching a hole in a wall. That gets your attention. You don't see very many pastors doing that. So I'll give him a pass on that point. And there's a lot of other stuff in there that is really good. That's why I chose it. It was the best one I could find. I think the problem has been all along is our tendency when we start talking about this stuff is, and I think I may have mentioned this last time, our tendency is to think in categories and dichotomously. So if I talk about grace, then I'm belittling truth. If I talk about grace as part of salvation, I'm belittling something else. It's dichotomous and it's categorical. And the challenge that we have in living is not balancing things, it's living with the tension of things. Grace and truth lived in tension means there is no exact point where I got it right. And that's why do we demand explanation? Why do we demand right, wrong? Why do we demand all these categories? One reason. So that I can be right. Why do I want to be right? So I don't feel bad. Guess what that is? 3 guesses and 2 don't count. Okay. So, Taylor, you had your hand up. Okay, yeah. Autumn?
Well, this is, I'm not, my thoughts are kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
But, thinking about, why we preach shame, do you think it's out of, a need for control? And, in the way of, I don't know, even from, an evangelistic point of view of,
Like,
Yeah.
we feel a need to, in our evangelism, like, have a tendency to change people.
Yep.
And so, because it's easier to control
Mm-hmm.
doing it out of shame
Right.
than out of grace.
Yep. No,
I don't know.
No, you're singing my tune. I quite honestly, I think, and I think I've said this. I have no idea what I've said, but I think I've said this. And that is that we honestly don't believe, well, let me put it the other way. We honestly believe that shame is the only thing that will change people's behavior. And, I might add, it does. It is entirely efficient. Okay? It is efficient. It gets people to change their behavior very, very quickly. For one reason, to avoid something. Grace, on the other hand, is not efficient. It's effective, but it's hardly efficient, because grace is about growth. Shame is about immediate change so that I feel better, and guess what happens after that? Sooner or later, the feeling better wears off, and I'm back to doing it all over again and feeling more shame. So yes, I think I think that the terror I have felt as I've studied this is it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in our evangelization. Evangelization isn't an invitation. It's trying to convince somebody. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to live free. And it's, to some degree, it's anxiety provoking, because I'm never entirely sure, because I use a shame standard, if I'm doing it the right way. Versus when I'm in a relationship with somebody, I'm not worried about doing it the right way. I'm worried about staying connected. And that's what's missing. Because shame is about imprisonment, grace is about freedom. And a lot of us would rather stay in our prison than be free. Quite honestly. I mean, we saw it, right? One of the primary words up there was shame. Somebody put it up there, was comfortable. And quite honestly, a prison cell is comfortable. Because it's known, it's predictable, I always know how to handle myself there, but when I go out into the world, I might do something prison-like wrong, and I go back to prison again. Okay, and that's the challenge that we face, folks, when we're talking about this. That's the challenge we face, is that even if you start acting freely, you will judge your free behavior by a shame-based standard. And then it's like, well, what does that mean? I mean, I can do anything I want? In the purest sense of the term? Yeah, you can. I mean, in my relationship with my wife, I can do anything I want. I can. Do I want to? No, I don't. I choose to restrain my behavior because, why? I love her. How much of our behavior towards Jesus is motivated by that? That's all I'm asking. Yeah, Taylor.
So, you kind of answered it, but if someone were to come to you, like a new convert,
right,
and was asking something like, I smoke weed, and I don't want to stop, but I want to be a Christian.
Yeah.
What would you say to them? That's not what is the first words out of your mouth that aren't.
You want to share? Oh. You don't even get that. Never mind. Taylor did. Come on. Lighten up, guys. See, that what you're describing, finally people are catching up or whatever. You want to share? Come on. I have to explain it to you? Good Lord. Okay, so I think what happens is, in a situation like that, is you describe two different things. On the one hand, you described a behavior, and on the other hand, you described a heart. So what do I want to encourage and support and speak into? The heart. Why? Because if I can clean up, think about Proverbs, okay? Guard your hearts because it's the wellspring of life. So this person's well has now been changed dramatically. But that old well has still got a lot of water running downstream that is still pretty contaminated. If I spend all of my time worrying about the downstream behavior and not worrying about how can I help them clean up this well with Jesus' help, with Jesus' power in their lives, how can I help them clean up that well? If I focus on that, guess what will happen downstream? That behavior will start being questioned. That's a far better process. And I think that's the key of what we're talking about here. Most of you guys have heard me talk about the Sermon on the Mount, and I'd say the Sermon on the Mount is a description of where it was. It's not the description of the content, because the Sermon on the Mount is a sermon about the heart. It is not about more rules and objectives, because Jesus came to fulfill all of those things. For what reason? To clean up the well. Why do people suffer with lust and anger and all the other things that he talked about? Because of that well wasn't taken care of. And the church, I won't say that. I don't want to say that. A lot of people like to spend all of their time, forget the church, let's just do me. I would rather pay attention to what goes on downstream than the harder thing of tracing my steps back to upstream and say, what's happening here in this well? It's a lot deeper, it's a lot murkier, and there's a lot more crap in there that I don't want to deal with. So I'll just change my behavior and say, look how nice my well is. And then I go back to the way I was. Shame is addressing the behavior. Grace is addressing the well. Lexi.
This subject has me questioning the validity of the doctrine of depravity. That's the underlying doctrine, I think, of a lot of pastors and churches. Mm-hmm. But nobody ever talks about it, because it's easier to say that humans are just broken and sinful. But it's another thing to attribute the goodness that humanity maybe still has because of grace alone, right, to God and not ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I think it all boils down to pride. Like I don't know, leaders especially don't want to look at a broken sinner on the street as if it's a weed or something. Right. You are made in the image of God. Right. Or it's more ontological than functional. I don't know. My mind is just racing like a theology class.
God bless you. I think the reality is that it's both and, not an either or. Because the unconverted heart, I don't think we're going to have any argument that it's depraved. I don't think we're going to have any argument on that. But I think a lot of the church is still stuck there on a Jeremiah 34:17 thinking about the heart, rather than what Paul talked about in the New Covenant to say, I've been given a new heart, which we have foreshadowing in Ezekiel and other places in the Old Testament. It says, God saying, I want to give them a new heart so they can truly become my people, which is what Jesus came to do essentially anyway. I think the doctrine, this is just me, I'm just a psychologist, what do I know? But I think the doctrine of depravity is a little one-sided. And I don't think it's outdated. I think it's accurate for what they're trying to describe. But it's been translated into today, and now we've gotten so focused on the depravity that we're not talking enough about the grace piece. So how do I control depravity? I shame people into it, to changing that, which it can't. I mean, it's like bringing in a metal rod that's bent and say, here, Duxie, straighten it out. Looks great. I got to use it that way anyway. So, yeah, Justin.
Do you like going to church?
Some churches I don't. I'm kind and respectful in those churches. But my problem has always been sitting in the pews and chairs, and it used to be pews, but I've always been in a position, and I think I have said this for a long, long time, and it's annoyed me that I've always been in a position where as a counselor, as a psychologist, I see the seedy underside of the church. Okay? I see all the broken people of the church. And then I go to church with them, and I hear a pastor beat the snot out of them, and then I'm having to repair all of that crap that he's thrown at them that has shame-tinged stuff all over it, and then they come into counseling with me, and I'm talking about there's freedom and grace, and there's like, who do I believe? So, I mean, I come to my opinions through a very, very long journey, and I was a card-carrying member of the evangelical church. I'm not so much anymore, but I am a pretty passionate follower of Jesus. And that's what guides me more. So if I find a church that tells me all of what Jesus teaches and lets me choose, I'm in. Doesn't have to be exactly the way I think it should be done, but I'm in. The ones that want to translate it for me, that's nice. Bye. So, yeah, there are things about church that I live with because it's filled with humans, including the pastors. And a lot of them I know. And so, okay. If I'm going to talk about grace, I better live by grace, right? So they're all on their journey too. They can be on that journey. Some of them don't admit that they are, but that's okay. I mean, that's just the way it goes. So, wow, how did we end up here? Yeah, Hope?
Something I think is difficult, like going through some of this material with myself and then starting to have conversations with other people, family, friends, roommates, all of that. Feeling like the process of actually walking through kind of the well process we're talking about is extremely intensive and requires so much, and it's hard enough to work through that for yourself, and then to see so many people around you just soaked their whole lives in shame and just completely functioning, thinking that is how they should function.
Right.
It gets overwhelming to me. I just want to I hardly know anything about this, but I wish I could just give it to you. I wish you could just go listen to Brene. Listen to Brene, like sit and listen to me, you know.
Yep.
Let's talk. But the actual process is it takes so much, and I'm just like, I can't give that to every person that I want to walk through that with. And
Right.
not every person wants to walk through that with me either. And
Yeah.
it's just like, it's really hard to be so connected with people, but not be able to walk through that with every person.
Right.
And I just am feeling this, like, I don't know, it's not like a loss, but it's just like a mourning.
Sadness.
Yeah.
Hmm?
That, like, just knowing that I can't do that. And, like, and it's not even my doing either. I think so much of it is the spirit and, like, people's willingness, but
Yeah.
just, becoming overwhelmed with that has been difficult to process, especially in the last 2 weeks. So.
Yeah, and it will be. I mean, I think you're always going to be crossing paths from probably this point forward, and I'm not trying to elevate any of this material into being something that it isn't, but I think once you begin to get a taste of this stuff, you cross paths with people, and at least for me, I guess because that's actually to some degree that's the life of a counselor, really. I mean, I come across all sorts of people that come in to talk to me and say, my life is a mess and my relationships are jacked up and I can't seem to do anything right. And then they sit back, cross their arms and say, I dare you to try to change me. And I think there's a lot of people that we come into contact with that way. And so they look at us, our struggle, our desire to live graciously with ourselves and others, and they say, oh, that's so nice, very patronizingly. And you, to some degree, I think at some level you shrug your shoulders and say, okay, I understand where you're coming from. You are certainly free to stay in that place. I've got some other people to talk to, really. And that's, but see, I think that also trusts the Holy Spirit too. I think we tend to underestimate, if we're trying and striving to live graciously with ourselves and others, I think we underestimate the seed that plants in somebody's head. That how is it that Hope lives the way she does, and I don't. I don't get the difference between that. Now, they may say, yeah, who cares? But now and again, they'll come back and say, how do you do that? And you say, let's have some coffee and talk. And the one thing that you want to stay away from is giving them a plan. Because plans tempt people back into shame. One of the things, some of you guys may hear it in family dynamics. Some of you, I don't know if there's any I talk a little bit about the spiritual journey, and one of the things that comes out of talking about that spiritual journey is the authors that I rely on talk about different stages, and the stages create more of a spiral than stage 1, stage 2, etc. And they divide up a person's spiritual journey in 3 different stages of building life, and then you hit something that they call the wall, which strips away all of your expectations about how God is supposed to be for you, and all of the stuff that tends to structure our relationship with God. And if you've ever read about the dark night of the soul, it would be very parallel to this idea of the wall. But when people leave, for a lot of people, they hit the wall and they go back to being productive for God rather than relating to God. And so the wall, the people that come out of it, they move from building a life to engaging in a journey inward, a journey outward, and the journey of love. And that's a discovery of grace. You hear Brennan talk about, he often would say, 34 years ago I was hijacked in a prayer chapel in a little convent in eastern Pennsylvania, and I was hijacked by Jesus' love. And that I think is what makes Brennan's message so irrepressible, was that he discovered 200 proof grace that had been stored in the back storeroom of a church, and suddenly he's saying, do you guys have any idea how powerful this stuff is? And if you want to go back in history and look for somebody that did that, read the autobiography of Martin Luther, because that's what happened to Martin Luther. In the outhouse, by the way. That's the one book that I've read that I've never read Scheiss so many times in one chapter in a Christian book. I won't do the interpretation. I think you figured it out. But he discovered grace there, and it changed him forever into the reformer that he was. He was annoying. He had a very abrasive personality. Very abrasive. People hated him or loved him, but the grace that he talked about really enamored them. So, anything else? Holy cow, I haven't even done one thing yet. Okay. Now, I have exactly 25 minutes.
This is what happened in Saxby's class.
What?
Like, our last class was human sexuality. We took the whole time asking him all these questions, and we only had 25 minutes left of class, too. He got all riled up.
Yeah, he does that. Yeah, time flies when you're having a blast. So, all right, now, the material, let me just give you a qualification, okay, for what I'm about to teach you. Yes, buckle up your seatbelt, put your trays in the upright position. The material I want to cover with you will feel like an inexorable temptation to shame. Okay? So I'll warn you ahead. I'll warn you ahead of time. Because what it begins to look at is, what kind of people are we? And what kind of people are we for others? Okay? And so I challenge you, I guess, challenge is probably strong, but I would encourage you to pay attention to what begins to bubble up as the farther in I talk with this stuff. Because it's really difficult to not listen to it, and I've already tested it out. The Tuesday morning class got just absolutely broadsided on Tuesday morning. First day back after a 3-day weekend. Life is so good. I've had some rest. And then, bam, they get blasted with this stuff. And they walk out looking like deer in a headlight. So it's a fair warning for you to understand what we're going into. It's really, really important stuff. It's an adaptation of some other material that some friends of mine who wrote the book Boundaries did before they did the book Boundaries. It was called Safe People. And the more I've read and the more I've actually talked to John and Henry, because I talk to them occasionally, and the more I say to them, so what you really were describing when you were talking about safe people was shame-resistant people. And when I was talking to Henry on the phone, he said, man, I wish I had Brown's material when we wrote this book. Because it is that. Because ultimately safe people are shame-resistant people, and that's what I want to talk about. So, this is where we're going to go. And the question would be, what is it? What does it look like? How would you describe somebody who's a safe person or a shame-resistant person? Now, I'm going to let that as a rhetorical statement because we've already blown a whole bunch of other time that I don't have time for. But you can write down in your notes and then check what it looks like when we go into this. The thing I would have you pay attention to is how do people describe, when they're having trouble in relationships with people, how do they describe people? And they describe them as, like you see here, he doesn't listen to me. She's so perfect that she doesn't understand my struggles. He seems so distant, I feel alone. She always tries to control me. He makes promises and doesn't really follow through. Condemning and judgmental, angry at me for something I did or didn't do. I tend to be my worst self with him or her, and I can't trust him or her. Other descriptors are I already mentioned them. What's interesting is to look at how God describes people when he has relationship trouble with them. And he doesn't focus on downstream behavior. He focuses on the qualities of the well. Proud and perfectionistic, unfaithful, far away, unloving. And the reason I make this distinction is that there's something that we really haven't been trained in very well. And that is that we haven't been trained in something that I would call character discernment. And part of the reason for that has been we have been drilled particularly in this culture for the last 10 years, we have been drilled to not be judgmental. So I say something that might be vulnerable to somebody else, and the next words out of my mouth is, don't judge me. Don't judge me. Well, we've internalized those things. And what that means is what we end up doing is we suspend judgment in order not to be judgmental. We suspend judgment altogether. And we discern nothing. So when we choose friendships, we choose on the outward appearance. And when we get deeper into that relationship, we experience the inside of them. And discernment is just like what God has displayed for us, is let's develop an ability to discern the nature of somebody else's heart. Not for judgment. Not for judgment, but to understand the person I am in relationship with. See, judgment takes a step beyond discernment. I understand the person's struggles. I understand perhaps some of the reasons why they do what they do, and therefore they are bad. Now we're in judgment. I mean, Jesus went so far as to say, don't even call a brother raka, which means empty-headed, because that's the overflow of the well. So we have to gain some understanding about character discernment. How do I discern? I've seen more women be in serial relationships with the same kind of guy over and over and over again. Why is that? Because they don't discern the character of the person they're in relationship with. So they make the same mistake over and over and over again. And the worst part about it is that they get into this relationship and hope springs eternal. You guys know the rest of that phrase, right? In the minds of idiots and fools. So they say, this one's different. Compared to who? The guy that abused you last time? What does that mean? What's the nature of this person you're in relationship with? Please tell me. Well, he kind of dabbles in pornography now and again. He goes out to the bar. Yeah, but he's a great guy. It just feels so good. And it's like, yeah, okay. So we don't have a whole lot of training in discerning character, And we've been sold this idea. The thing is when we're told not to be judgmental, we don't discern, we just suspend judgment. And that's where the problem comes in. So, what I want to do is I want to describe 3 different kind of groups of people to you, okay? And these groups of people, no one is one of these things, okay? There are lots of people that are combinations of these. But the first group of people is the people that we would refer to as abandoners. And abandoners begin with promises about companionship, will be friends forever, and the commitment. And what happens is they end up leaving when we need them the most. And they move on. The sad part about abandoners is they leave a wake of people who has, as a result of that interaction, start to not trust people. And they've proven that there's a good reason not to. But the reality is oftentimes abandoners are abandoned people. Just like you probably have heard the phrase, abused people abuse people. Abandoning people have been abandoned. And they're sure, this is where the shame comes in. They are absolutely sure that if anybody gets close enough to know them as they know themselves, they will be rejected just like they reject themselves. Okay, so there's an underlying current of shame that's embedded in this. So they're afraid of that closeness, and they destroy trust in the future for other people. And that's a part of this group of what we're talking about with abandoners. The second group of people are the people we refer to as critics. And critics are people who tend to take a parental role with everyone. They are judgmental. They speak the truth without love. As a matter of fact, they speak the truth so that they look better, so they look wise, so they look like they're being helpful. So truth becomes a commodity rather than something to speak to one's heart. Grace is not part of their economy. It just simply isn't. They are more concerned with confronting errors than with making connections. These folks tend to use shame to control other people. Into the image of their own making, I might add. And for a lot of times these folks confuse sinfulness or weakness with sinfulness. Now you might say, well, isn't that so? Well, yeah, sorta. But the places where I'm weak, am I sinful? Yeah, I probably have to admit that that's so. But then the next question is, so what? What's next? What's next? And so their tendency is to condemn first, because they're really the only way to change behavior is to get people to avoid feeling bad. That's their formula for changing behavior. And that's the critics. Okay? Again, no one person is one of these things. No one person is. As a matter of fact, some people cycle through them depending on the person that they're in relationship with. The interesting thing about it, which would be to connect up with what you were talking with family psych, is in a lot of cases, we interact with people how we've been interacted with. So the thing that I often will say in family psych, family dynamics, is I will parent myself how I've been parented, which usually shows up in how I handle my own emotions. and it shows up with how I handle other people's emotions. Okay? So, there's a good portion of this that comes up. The last group of people we would call the irresponsibles. These are the people, I love to say, irresponsibles are an absolute blast to be around. They are fun all the time, and if you have any impulsive desires that you communicate with irresponsibles, their first response is, do it. Which means they have problems delaying gratification, they don't consider the consequences of their actions, and they don't follow through on commitments. Because whatever is the most interesting thing at that point in time is what they're most taken by. Now, one way to take a look at this is my response. In a lot of cases, and I've mentioned in the other kind of scenarios, is that if I want to know the kind of person I'm around, and remember, again, we're talking about general, broad profiles of unsafe people, which also means we has been one of them, okay? Don't forget Brene Brown's metaphor of the marble jar. Remember that. Because there is never, ever somebody who is always safe. There are seasons, there are times that people can be patently unsafe that are generally safe. They have the marble jar filled up, and in that moment in time, they're not safe, and you take the marble out. You don't destroy the marble jar. But a lot of times we can figure out who we're around by how we respond. And with irresponsibles, what you find is we tend to be drawn to these people, and we end up picking up after them. We apologize to others for them. We make excuses for them. We give them chance after chance after chance. We nag them. In a lot of cases, nagging is a veiled form of anger. And we resent them. The problem is a boundaries issue, which is the other fun topic of the class, is that we nag and resent them because if they just get it right, then finally my life would be okay. And so it's a boundary issue between me and them. I need them to behave a certain way for me to be able to be okay. So we've got these three big, broad groups of people that we're talking about. No one person fits into them. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at two different things. One is the personal traits of an unsafe person. Okay? So personal meaning what goes on interior. All right? And then we will shift gears and talk about the interpersonal traits of unsafe people. The one thing I would challenge you to do, which is really, really uncomfortable, and I know it is because I've done it, is use this as a mirror, not as a telescope. Boy, I really wish so-and-so would have heard about this. So, the personal traits start with this. The personal traits of an unsafe person is they love to make it appear as if they have it all together. They're always setting themselves up to be able to help other people in an attempt, and it's key, because just because you help somebody doesn't put you in this category, but in an attempt to really distract attention away from the stuff that they know is going on inside of them that they don't want to pay any attention to. They're religious instead of spiritual. What do I mean by that? They're committed to appearing spiritual rather than cultivating a vital, sometimes very disturbing relationship with Jesus. And the minute you offer them feedback, or the minute that you say, it would have been really helpful if you'd said it a different way than you did, they attack you. Suddenly, you're the problem. Well, if you just heard it the right way, everything would be fine. So they get defensive. And a lot of times the defensiveness, remember, like I said, a lot of times it's not just how dare you, getting up in the grill and getting offended and all. A lot of times defensiveness ends up being a lot more subtle than that, because if suddenly you begin to realize that now you're defending yourself when you were just trying to give them feedback to help the relationship get stronger, somebody's been defensive, not you, because the subject isn't you. You were trying to help the relationship along. Some other personal traits: they are self-righteous instead of humble. Remember that in a lot of cases, unsafe people are really good at creating appearances of humility that aren't really. So they end up being self-righteously humble. They only apologize, but they never change their behavior. And they avoid working on their problems instead of dealing with them. They make promises all the time to deal with these things, but they never follow through. Now, wait, hang on to that thought for a second. I don't know about you, but when I read some of these, this gets really uncomfortable, because there are a number of these up here that you got to take a number behind me. We've probably all done these. Okay? So let's be clear, and let's be that this is not an exhaustive list, and it doesn't mean that, I had that one, I'm unsafe. No. No, it's probably something to pay attention to. But yeah, Taylor. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me, this is a generalized statement, that men feel like they always have to work on improvement. Like self-improvement is super big right now, especially with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, right.
It's like, get better and better and better and better. And then, I don't know, do you think that is a message that is more specifically targeted towards men right now, or what's your experience with that?
Has anybody seen the Gillette commercial? Yeah. Has anybody seen the watch company commercial? I'll put it up for you. Okay, let me just, and I'll put them up side by side, and you tell me what's portrayed as far as masculinity is concerned. Now, that's Saxby's job. He can talk about that. But I think there's a lot of stuff that Jordan Peterson has been talking about that's all good stuff. But I think at some level, Jordan Peterson still is very much of a monist, not a dualist. And because of that, then, he's probably not going to be talking about the heart much. He's going to be talking more about behavioral things. All good stuff. But he's not addressing this issue. And so I don't think one gender has the corner on shame more than the other. I think it is also not coincidental that Brene Brown's first book, which I did not ask you to read, was for women. And it talked about body image and activity and the roles that they play in people's lives and all these other things. And that was the book I started reading when I started kind of wading my way into this material. And actually, I found more there for both genders than I did just for women. Of course, you all know I live in a household of women, so I have lots of targets to say, you need this book. But I'm not stupid enough to do that. I am smart. I've been around long enough. I just let the dog go out first. So I think I think in a lot of ways the message is that way, but I think the problem is because it's so identity oriented with a lot of this stuff with men and masculinity and everything else, it is a morass of shame for men. And it will perpetuate a lot of the same behaviors because we are not talking about the core issues that are going on in men or women for that matter. Brene Brown has brought these things into the limelight, if you will. I think a lot of women relate to her and her presentation a lot more than men do for lots of good reasons, not the least of which is that she's a female as well. But at the same time, yeah, I think there's a lot of that going on right now. And these dueling commercials are really quite fascinating to watch because I think that's a pretty good fix on how men are seen versus how women are seen and the mirror images and all that goes into that. So yeah, absolutely. Jordan Peterson's doing great stuff and he's talking about really good stuff. He's the first one that has kind of taken on this behemoth of correct language and all the other things that I'm just like, yay, I'm glad it's you. But at the same time, I mean, it's that. He reveals, he flirts with the unity of all truth stuff. But I don't think he has a word for it because he's been clinically trained. So, okay, you guys have enough emotional reserve to take one more? Okay. Here's one more. They believe they're perfect instead of admitting their faults. They may not say, or they may be able to tell you they're not perfect. They know they're not, but in their hearts, by their behavior, tells you that they believe that. They blame others instead of taking responsibility. They lie instead of telling the truth. That does not mean it is an open-faced lie. It's just the omission of certain things, truths. And they're stagnant instead of growing. They're seemingly telling the same story over and over again, even though the characters have been changed to protect their identities. Okay? Okay, we will stop there. We will shift gears next time to look at interpersonal stuff. Any reactions or questions with this stuff? I'm sure I might hear in a few journals here and there, but that's okay. All right, have a good weekend. Yeah, I'll see you.